And joining us now is Simon Shuster, reporter for Time magazine based in New York City by way of Moscow, Kyiv and Berlin. He has previously covered Russia and the former Soviet Union for Reuters, the Associated Press, the Moscow Times and Foreign Policy. And his latest article at Time is a visit to the crime scene Russian troops left behind at a summer camp in Bucha. And he joins us from Kyiv. Welcome to Background Briefing, Simon Shuster.
Thanks. Nice to be with you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And it seems that this decisive battle shaping up in the Donbas is one that President Zelensky said that Ukraine has to win. It's not as if they fight to a draw, they have to win. And then on the other side, it would seem that Putin has to win as well. He has to take something home to the Russian people to show some sort of success, real or cosmetic. So how do you see this decisive battle shaping up?
It's going to be a very difficult one, probably fairly prolonged. The advisors to Zelensky that I've talked to and some military analysts that I've been following say that the forces on both sides are formidable, and essentially it's a toss-up, as one put it, in military terms. So it's expected to start in the coming days. There's some rain expected in the coming days in that area and in Kyiv, which one of Zelensky's advisors told me is very good luck because it prevents aerial bombardment from happening. So it grounds a lot of planes. They can't see their targets, so they don't fly. But other than that, it seems like a lot of the forces are already in position for that battle. It's hard to say if it'll be decisive in this war. It depends on how it goes. But you're right that both sides have an enormous amount at stake.
And given the rain and the fact that the ground is thawing out in the spring, is the terrain muddy and therefore not optimal for tank maneuvers?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, we've seen throughout the conflict so far just how ineffective some of these old school kind of Soviet or World War II tactics are with tank movements and so on. First of all, when armored combat drones were introduced into that context, they proved extremely effective at taking out Russian tank columns and Russian hardware. So I think that was a bitter lesson for the Russian side. They were not expecting to face such resistance from the air because Ukraine does not have a major air force. But the drones have been very effective, so that's a big factor. It's going to be a big factor as well in the east. But the way it's shaping up, it looks like it's going to be a major artillery duel. Both sides have an enormous amount of firepower. Just these cannons, howitzers, and various, multiple rocket launchers, things like that. They're going to fire at each other, and that's a really devastating weapon. It causes enormous damage to civilian areas, towns, everything around it, because a lot of those rockets, basically all those rockets, are not guided. They're just they're lobbed at a set of coordinates roughly in the direction of the enemy, and they land where they land. So it's going to be a battle reminiscent of some battles from decades ago, to be honest, with the use of artillery. And air power probably is going to figure into it as well, but Ukraine has proven pretty good at shooting down Russian aircraft, and they have more and more anti-aircraft systems coming in, both shoulder-fired things like Stinger missiles and truck-mounted ones that are being provided by European allies, Western allies. So it's hard to say if it's an even match, but it's close to it. So it's really hard to say at this point. No one can say how it's going to go.
And the U.S. has supplied counter-battery radar, which apparently is very effective in targeting the Russian artillery. I'm assuming that has already gotten, along with the howitzers, have gotten to the Ukrainians. But I'm surprised, to Simon Shuster, that the arms are flying in literally into the airport in Kyiv in chartered 747s. And Russia has sent a diplomatic note warning the U.S., and the Deputy Foreign Minister recently warned that they'd start targeting NATO trucks bringing weapons in. That is a line that hasn't been crossed so far. Have the Russians not targeted like 747 sitting on a tarmac in Kyiv? That would seem to be, if they could blow up a shopping mall, they could certainly blow up a 747.
Well, the Russians have signaled very clearly that any kind of supply lines are targets that they consider, ripe for attack. I think it was March 12th or 13th last month, about a month ago. Russia fired a bunch of cruise missiles at a base in western Ukraine that was being used to receive and redistribute a lot of the aid coming in, the military aid from the west. There was a base near the city of Lviv. So Russia has already done that. It hasn't done it recently, and it's one of the decisions on the Russian side militarily that I think maybe puzzles and also worries people in Kyiv. They're not sure why Russia is holding back, but that doesn't mean Russia won't attack those targets in the future.
And what are we to make of statements by Vladimir Zelensky and by also the CIA suggesting that Russia might use nuclear weapons? Is that a deduction from the diplomatic note of warning? What's behind that?
I don't know, but yes, that's definitely been a stable feature of Russian rhetoric. Both on Russian state television, there's almost daily talk of using nuclear weapons, and there have been some veiled and not so veiled threats from Russian officials that is on the table. Russia has an enormous arsenal, both of strategic nuclear weapons that could destroy an entire city, but also tactical nuclear weapons that are smaller and can be used to target a collection of troops or a military base or part of a city. I had a long conversation yesterday with one of Zelensky's military advisors, and we talked about this. And the takeaway for me was essentially that, yes, we know Russia has these things. They're threatening to use them, but they refuse to allow the fear of that scenario to paralyze them to such an extent that they've continued working in the presidential compound, right? Not always underground in the bunkers, but also just in their offices there, where I've met some of them in the usual offices where Zelensky's team would operate before the war. And some of them say, yes, we know that aerial bombardment or one of these hypersonic cruise missiles is a major threat. Tactical nuclear weapons are a major threat, but they have decided not to run away from the capital and not to leave the compound. So they essentially have to continue working. They've made a decision to continue working in spite of that threat.
Well, I'm sure Putin is furious about the loss of the flagship for the Black Sea Fleet. Is it possible, or is it logical to assume, Simon Shuster, that maybe Putin needs a win here? I don't see an end to this war, at least in terms of a peace treaty. There may be an armistice, but Putin all along, for the last decade or more, has wanted to destabilize Ukraine on the cheap. And the talk about joining NATO, well, you could argue that Ukraine is already a member of NATO. That's where all the weapons are coming from. So is that logical to suggest that maybe, assuming that Putin will accept a kind of cosmetic victory, would that be the best outcome?
Well, first, I'd say that Ukrainians certainly don't feel like they're members of NATO. They're grateful for the weapons and military and diplomatic support they're getting, but they insist constantly that it's not enough, that they need more, that the battle in the east is going to start any minute, and they don't have the hardware that they need to win that part of the war. So I think if they were a NATO ally, the picture would look very different on the ground for them and in terms of their sense of support from their allies. I don't know what Putin would accept as a face-saving end to the conflict. I think after the terrible atrocities and war crimes that we saw in Bucha, outside of Kyiv, that made the negotiating process much more difficult. I talked to two of the lead negotiators on the Ukrainian side. They told me that they actually wanted to stop the process altogether after the Bucha massacre, and because they just couldn't bear to look their Russian counterparts in those negotiations in the face. As one of them put it, we wanted revenge, not diplomacy. But it was Zelensky, they told me, that said even if there's a 1% chance of reaching a ceasefire or some kind of armistice through negotiations, we have to continue on that front. And he essentially ordered them to keep going, keep talking, and they have been talking in the last 2 weeks or so since the Bucha tragedy and the massacres in other towns around Kyiv have become public and made headlines around the world. So those negotiations are ongoing. But again, it's impossible to say what would be acceptable for Putin. It's, as the Ukrainians have said, the outcome of negotiations are going to come as the result of the fighting in the east. So depending on how successful they can be in mounting a defense of Ukraine, that will determine their negotiating posture. And I think that goes the same for the Russians. They're trying to seize territory as much as possible. They're trying to take certainly the city of Mariupol in order to have something to show for this terrible war that they started, that Putin started, and then come to the negotiating table with something that they can demand, some gains also that they can take back to the Russian public back home and say, look, we've accomplished at least this. But it's really, I wouldn't say it's far from the minds of the Ukrainian side, but they're very focused on the battle in the east that's beginning any day now, and winning that battle, and they're less focused on negotiations.
Well, Simon Shuster, I thank you so much for joining us here today from Kyiv.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Simon Shuster, who's a reporter for Time magazine based in New York City by way of Moscow, Kyiv and Berlin. He was previously covered Russia and the former Soviet Union for Reuters, the Associated Press, the Moscow Times and Foreign Policy. And his latest article at Time is a visit to the crime scene Russian troops left behind at a summer camp in Bucha. And he joined us from Kyiv. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back examining why diverse democracies fall apart and how they can endure.